Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. This is the one you've been waiting for. The showdown between Intel's Core i7-7800X and AMD's Ryzen 1600. We've seen how they compare for productivity workloads, but if you like to game as well, does Intel still take the cake when it comes to high-end gaming? So just quickly, what do you need to know before we jump into the benchmarks? Well, about the CPUs themselves, the 7800X currently costs $415 US, but has an MSRP of $390. Meanwhile, the 1600 currently retails for just $215, so almost half the price, and well, that's worth keeping in mind as we proceed. AMD's AM4 platform also costs significantly less than Intel's LGA 2066, but I'll touch on that a bit more later. For testing, we have 30 games in total, all of which have been tested at 1080p using the GTX 1080 Ti. And no, I'm not going to test at 1440p or 4K. You'll have to look elsewhere for those results. I'm not really interested in testing gaming performance of CPUs under GPU-limited scenarios. So, moving on. Both systems were configured with DDR4 3200 CL14 memory, though whereas the Ryzen system only gets 16GB, the Intel system gets 32GB. This shouldn't impact the results in any way, but the reason I've done this is quite simple. I don't have a 32GB kit yet that works with Ryzen at the 3200 memory speed. Alright, so into the benchmarks, and first up we have World of Tanks, and this isn't a particularly demanding title, but the idea here is to include a wide range of games, so not all of them will be CPU demanding. Be aware that this game is capped at 120 FPS, and while it is possible to circumvent that cap, it's not something most people are going to do, so I haven't bothered to do it myself. Anyway, here we see that the Ryzen 1600 had no trouble pushing the GTX 1080 Ti to the frame cap, and it was even a few frames faster than the 7800X, which is worth noting. Grand Theft Auto 5 is a game that never really played that well with Ryzen CPUs. It is an older title from 2015 and therefore does predate Ryzen by quite a few years. Anyway, despite its age, the game is still very demanding and it makes good use of all system resources. What's interesting to note here is that the overclocked R5 1600 was just 6% slower than the 7800X, and that's pretty impressive given it's also clocked 15% lower. It's also a massive improvement over the 20% margin that the Ryzen CPU trails the 7700K by. Previously, I had benchmarked PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds at the start of the game, you know, that area where everyone runs around in invincibility mode waiting for the game to start. I feel like this was probably a mistake for a few reasons. Firstly, it is extremely difficult to gather reliable data here, and secondly, it's significantly more demanding than the actual gameplay itself. You're never going to find everyone in a small area of the map when playing, so that makes that benchmark a little bit unrealistic. Anyway, I'm now testing within the actual game, so that is dropping in to the main map and then starting at the same location each time. From there, I do follow the same path for 60 seconds, and the data seen in the graph is an average of 3 runs. As you can see, the R5 1600 performs very well in this title. Again, please note this game is frame capped at 144 FPS, and I'm not sure if there's a workaround to remove it. It's relatively easy or not. I didn't come across that information. That said, the 144 FPS is plenty. I can't imagine many players will be able to take advantage of more in this title. Although the game is frame capped, the R5 1600 was consistently faster than the 7800X by a small margin, delivering around 7% more frames when looking at the minimums. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt plays well on both the 7800X and R5 1600. That said, the Intel CPU was faster. The game isn't frame capped, so if the GTX 1080 Ti could deliver over 200 FPS using the ultra quality settings, we would likely see that with a CPU such as the 7700K. Anyway, the R5 1600 was 15% slower than the 7800X out of the box, so that's a fairly decent margin. However, once both CPUs are overclocked, that margin is reduced to just 6%. So while still slower, an impressive result nonetheless for the Ryzen CPU. Again, we see this time when testing with Rise of the Tomb Raider, the R5 1600 is 12% slower than the 7800X, and I'm looking at the average frame rate this time since the minimums are identical. However, once overclocked, the R5 1600 was just 1.5% slower on average, but 12% faster for the minimum, so that's a very interesting result indeed. Again, these figures are based on a 3-run average, and the Ryzen CPU was consistently faster for the minimum. I have continued to test Ashes of the Singularity Escalation using the Crazy preset, which pretty much runs into a GPU limited scenario with the Intel CPUs. That said, the same isn't true for the Ryzen 5 1600, which I found quite surprising. Here it struggled to get the most out of the GTX 1080 Ti. Overclocking certainly helped, but it was still a little bit off the pace, 1 or 2 frames down from maxing out the GeForce graphics card. Far Cry Primal is a bit of a funny game, and it was one of the few titles that really baffled me when testing Ryzen for the first time all those months ago. The performance was just so much lower than expected when compared to the 7700K, and yet we found the exact same thing when testing the 7800X more recently. In fact, the 7800X and R5 1600 do deliver very similar numbers in this title, and I'd say overall the performance was decent. Frame rates never dip below 60 FPS, so a very smooth experience at all times. The Division is a GPU limited title, and while the R5 1600 is slightly down on the 7800X and 7700K for the average frame rate, it does roughly match the minimum result. And at well over 100 FPS, you have to wonder if the margins even matter at this point. They certainly don't if you plan on running a graphics card equal to or slower than, say, a GeForce GTX 1070. Hitman is a game that features a huge number of NPCs, and this can be quite taxing on the CPU, and we've certainly seen that in the past with this title. This is another title where the 7800X fell quite a way behind the 7700K, and the same is also true for the R5 1600. That said, whereas the 1600 was 15% slower than the 7800X at the stock clock speeds, overclocking both processors reduced the margin to 0, as both allowed for no less than 61 FPS to be rendered. I have to admit, I do have a confession to make. I completely botched the Quantum Break benchmark results in the previous 7800X versus 7700K video, so sorry about that. I'm not sure what went wrong, but for some reason I seem to be frame capped at around 52, 53 FPS. I wasn't testing with VSync enabled or anything like that. In order to fix the issue, I had to actually delete all the config files and start over, something I should have noticed and picked up on, but I didn't. So again, sorry about that. A bit of a strange bug there, but anyway, the results are now fixed and I have triple checked everything. Here we see that at the stock clock speeds, the minimum frame rate for the R5 1600 is down on the 7800X by about a 13% margin. However, as we've seen numerous times already, overclocking the 1600 really helps it close the margin, and now it's just 4% slower. Moving on, for testing Overwatch, I used my standard bot match test, which is very CPU intensive. Despite that, the Ryzen 5 1600 stood up very well and even edged ahead of the 7800X once both CPUs were overclocked, so a great result for the plucky little Ryzen 5 CPU here. Doom has an obvious 200 FPS cap, and unlike the 7800X, the R5 1600 had no trouble reaching it at the stock clock speeds. Not much else to really say here, so let's move on to Total War Warhammer. And this is a game I've tested out of interest's sake using both DirectX 12 and DirectX 11. The focus will be on the more modern DX12 API, but as I said, the DirectX 11 results have also been included purely out of interest's sake. Here the R5 1600 easily beats the 7800X, and when overclocked the minimum frame rate was 16% greater. The Ryzen CPU did still trail the 7700K by a decent margin here, and Intel's quad-core proves to be quite the beast in this game. Using the older DX11 API, the R5 1600 is now 22% faster than the 7800X once overclocked. The margin has opened up thanks to the GTX 1080 Ti's ability to render more frames when using DirectX 11. Out of the box, the Ryzen processor gets a little trampled in Mirror's Edge Catalyst, as it was a rather massive 22% slower than the 7800X when comparing the minimum frame rate. Yet once overclocked, the 1600 did reduce the margin to just 7%, and again, with well over 100 FPS, in fact 120 FPS at all times, you have to wonder how important these margins really are. Nonetheless, this is a win for the Blue Man Group, so let's move on to see what F1 2016 has for us. Here the R5 1600 was 19% slower than the 7800X when comparing the out-of-the-box performance. That's a pretty big win for Intel, but yet again we find that AMD is able to make up some serious ground through overclocking. At 4GHz, the 1600 is now just 6% slower than the 7800X, which is of course clocked at 4.7 GHz. Jumping back into another DirectX 12 title, we have Deus Ex Mankind Divided, and this is a rather poor one for Ryzen, at least when paired with the GeForce graphics card. Something about the way the NVIDIA drivers handle the DX12 API just doesn't agree with Ryzen. Even once overclocked, the R5 1600 was still 19% slower than the 700X, so this just, like I said, isn't a great title for the red team. The performance is hardly poor from an end user's perspective, but it's a lot weaker when compared to the competition. Moving on to show what I mean about Ryzen doing poorly with a GeForce graphics card using DirectX 12 is Deus Ex. I retested using DX11, and as you can see, a radically different picture here is the R5 1600 is now able to match the 7800X in this title. Battlefield 1 is probably one of the more important titles in this list, and here the R5 1600 was able to match the 7800X out of the box. We find much the same once both CPUs are overclocked, as they allowed the GTX 1080 Ti to spit out no less than 160 FPS. So while the 7700K might be a little faster, the 1600X is certainly suitable for 144Hz gamers in this title. Mafia 3 is a bit of a dodgy title, and I might even end up dropping it soon depending on how many of you are keen to see it remain. Initially, Ryzen looked great in this title, however, with each patch, Ryzen's performance seemed to go backwards while Intel's improved, so I'm not sure what's up with that. Upon initial release, Ryzen was actually beating the 7700K in this title at the stock clock speeds, but now it trails by a 32% margin when looking at the minimum frame rate, so again, I'm not really sure what's up with that. Overclocked, the 1600 does recover quite a bit and is now just 7% slower than the 700X, but still those stock clock results are concerning, and I'm a little suspicious as to what's going on here. Anyway, Mafia 3 is a poorly optimized title, and there will no doubt be some better built games coming up soon, so I can probably replace it with one of those. Gears of War 4 is another game like Deus Ex Mankind Divided that just doesn't play well with the Ryzen CPUs when using a GeForce graphics card. This is a DirectX 12 only title, so until AMD release a high-end GPU, this is how things are going to have to be. Gears of War 4 is a reasonably well put together game though, but I personally would love to drop it because I just hate having to deal with that rubbish Windows Store. This is the only game I test with from the Windows Store, and unless there's some incredible game released in the future, it'll probably be the last game I ever buy on this horrid platform. Titanfall 2 is a game that plays well on just about anything, and as a result it doesn't actually provide us with any interesting data. That said though, it is great to see the more affordable Ryzen 6 hanging in there with the more expensive CPUs in this title. Moving on, we have Civilization 6, and we're back to DirectX 12, but this one plays very well with the Ryzen/GeForce combo, and even out of the box, the R5 1600 is able to clean up the Core i7-7800X. Overclocked, the R5 1600 is now 14% faster than the 700X, though it is still 10% slower than the 7700K. Dishonored 2 provides more interesting results, though they do reflect what we've seen in most of the titles already tested. Stock, the R5 1600 is 7% slower than the 700X, while quite shockingly it pulled ahead by a 9% margin once overclocked, an incredible result for the red team here. That said though, it does go a bit south for AMD when testing with Watch Dogs 2, and this is a title that's never really been that kind to the Ryzen CPUs. Here the R5 1600 was 24% slower at the stock clock speeds, though that rather large margin is reduced to just 9% once both CPUs are overclocked. Please note that previously the 7700K and 7800X were tested in Resident Evil 7 with a little bit of upscaling going on. For this test I have adjusted the scaling to 100%, and now we are truly reflecting 1080p performance. For the first time we are seeing the R5 1600 fall further behind the 7800X once both CPUs are overclocked. Stock, the Ryzen CPU was 4% slower, while overclocked it was 6% slower. These aren't huge margins by any means, but it is the first time we've seen this. Although For Honor is mostly a GPU-bound game, and we see that as all three CPUs are able to deliver around the same average frame rate, there is some variance when looking at the minimum. What's really interesting here is that the R5 1600 actually beats not just the 7800X, but also the 7700K when stock and overclocked. This is a very curious result indeed, especially in a title where the CPU isn't that heavily taxed. Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Wildlands is another GPU-limited game for the most part. The R5 1600 and 7800X deliver very similar performance, and here we see that the 7700K isn't a great deal faster. Mass Effect Andromeda is a game that's played well with Ryzen since day one, and has continued to work well with Ryzen after numerous updates. Overclocked, the R5 1600 is able to get the most out of the GTX 1080 Ti, and here it matched the 7800X and 7700K. Boy oh boy did I waste a lot of time trying to work out what the heck was going on with Dawn of War 3. The game was recently patched, I believe it was the 11th of July, don't quote me on that, but it was sometime around there. Anyway, it was sometime this month, and the hotfix update completely crippled performance in this title, reducing the GTX 1080 Ti to around 50 FPS. So I've had to use a previous version of the game for this benchmark because I didn't have the Ryzen 5 results, obviously. So please don't ask me how I was able to do that. Anyway, here we see that the R5 1600 is able to match the 7800X in Dawn of War 3, so some very competitive performance here indeed. And just to touch on the issues that I talked about at the start, the developers are aware of the issues, the performance issues that the hotfix created, and they're working on a fix, so hopefully that comes in the next week or two. Moving on, we have yet another game, this time Prey, and this one is a very well put together title. It's not particularly demanding on the CPU, but it still doesn't hinder CPU performance either, like what we see with a game such as Far Cry Primal, for example. Here the 7700K, 7800X and R5 1600 all deliver similar performance, especially once they're all overclocked. Finally, wrapping things up, we have Dirt 4, and this title plays very well on the Ryzen 5 1600. Stock, the AMD processor was able to maintain more frames than the 700X, and once overclocked, it was just outright faster, even matching the 7700K for the minimum frame rate, so a stellar result for AMD here. I have to admit, this just seems wrong. I still can't get used to seeing AMD CPUs consuming less power than their Intel counterparts. It feels unnatural. For the longest time, those horrible FX series chips sat well atop of the power charts, and I'm so glad we've been able to move on from that. For what seemed like a similar level of performance, and I will touch on that in a moment, the R5 1600 consumed quite a lot less power when compared to the 7800X. With both chips overclocked, the Ryzen system consumed 15% less power and 18% less before we did any overclocking. So that's a definite win for AMD right there. Who would have predicted this at the beginning of the year? I'll admit it certainly wouldn't have been me. Well, I did try to get to the point quite quickly on this one, but at this stage I've blurted out something like 3,000 words, so apologies for that. Anyway, I hope you, like me, found the results really interesting. I very much enjoyed the testing, and I'm quite surprised by how well the Ryzen 5 1600 is getting on today. It's always been good, but it seems like the fine-tuning AMD's done over the past few months has come together to make it that much better for gaming. I mean, look at this graph I'm about to throw up. It's good stuff. I actually ended up spending an extra 2 days going over the results, mostly retesting and comparing the Core i7-7700K and Ryzen 5 1600, because the figures we're looking at here just seemed too close. Overall, out of the box, the R5 1600 was just 13% slower than the 7700K. That's quite incredible. Keep in mind though, there were a few GPU limited games, and even worse, a few that were frame capped. But still, they weren't frame capped to 60 FPS or anything like that. Many of them had frame limits of 120 or some even greater, so the Ryzen CPU was still pushing the GTX 1080 Ti very hard. Once overclocked, the R5 1600 was just 9% slower than the 7700K, while it matched the 7800X. That's right, it matched the $390 US processor. Okay, so I'm sure you're itching to see what the overall picture looks like, so here it is. Right, so what you're looking at here is the Ryzen 5 1600 versus the Core i7-7800X, comparing the overclock results, looking at the minimum frame rates. As we just saw, both averaged a minimum of 103 FPS across the 30 games tested, and here we can clearly see that the R5 1600 enjoyed some wins and suffered through a few losses. It is worth noting though that the number of titles won and lost are very even indeed. And as such, there are a few ways you could adjust the data to give either CPU a slight edge, but let's be honest, it would only be that, a very slight edge. For example, removing AMD's worst performing title, Gears of War 4, the R5 1600 will become just 1% faster than the 700X, and that's a negligible difference. Remove the second worst title, Deus Ex Mankind Divided, using DirectX 12, and the R5 1600 is still just 1% faster. And that's the beauty of testing with such a massive sample of games. Also, please note that because there was a very large difference in performance between running Deus Ex Mankind Divided with DirectX 11 and DirectX 12 with the Ryzen CPU, I've included both the results in this graph. However, I've only included the DX12 results for Total War Warhammer and not the DX11 results, since the R5 1600 was much faster in both tests, so I favoured the DirectX 12 results as they are based on the newer API. No doubt some viewers will declare that I'm biased towards a certain company, but if that were really true, I would just omit certain games from the results. I mean, would you guys really complain if I only tested 20 games? How many other media outlets conduct 20 game benchmarks using 100% fresh data? If I was biased towards AMD, there is no way you would see Deus Ex Mankind Divided or Gears of War 4 in this list. Meanwhile, if I were biased towards Intel, I'd drop Total War Warhammer and Civilization 6, for example. Anyway, enough of that. I know the vast majority of you appreciate the lengths I go to try and deliver balanced, fair, honest content. Right, so if you're after value for money, it's pretty clear the Ryzen 5 1600 is the way to go, and this is why I recently named it the best value performance desktop CPU in my top 5 CPUs video. It was unlikely that the Core i7-7800X was going to change that, but I had hoped that the performance would at least be a compelling reason to buy Intel's new 6-core processor. This slide that you've been staring at for the past few moments really says it all. You can spend roughly twice as much to receive essentially the same experience, and this is true if you're a gamer or a worker. Yeah, let's go with worker. I'm sure there are those of you who are chomping at the bit to point out the 700X system has more memory, and well, you'd be right. It would be possible to save some money here and get 4GB modules, but who invests in a premium platform to have 16GB of memory and no less 4GB modules? I've also selected the very best premium 16GB kit for the Ryzen CPU, as this is what I used for testing, but be aware there are cheaper options out there. Additionally, Ryzen will hit 4GHz with the box cooler, but it will be a more mild experience with a $20 aftermarket cooler like the Cooler Master 212, so keep that in mind. The 7800X, on the other hand, cannot be overclocked to 4.7GHz using a 240mm all-in-one closed-loop solution. I required a $380 custom loop setup to achieve that overclock, so also be aware of that. Wrapping things up, I think it's fair to say that the Ryzen 5 1600 delivers a very similar experience to the Core i7-7800X, and once overclocked, there's really no distinguishing the two when it comes to gaming. It also consumed less power, that's the Ryzen 5 processor, costs considerably less, and it comes with a smart little box cooler. Actually, it's not really that little, is it? Anyway, the Ryzen 5 1600, in my opinion, is the obvious choice here, and I can't think of many arguments or reasons I'd make for buying the 700X over the R5 1600. In fact, I'd hate to be tasked with that job. You'd have to come up with something ludicrous like AMD sticking their CPUs together with glue or something like that. I'm your host, Steve. See you again soon, guys.